We'll have our panelists respond to a set of questions, just providing a bit of context and what they see as the solutions. We focused this press briefing to solutions because all of us understand the context, we understand the issues, we understand the problem, and I'm sure all of us can do the analysis of the problem very well. So really focus on solutions. I'll start with Jason. African governments are struggling with structural traps that have been there for ages. What do you see? First of all, if you can just speak to a few of these structural traps or structural deficiencies that the continent has faced, and what you see as a solution to those deficiencies that you'll speak to.
Thank you very much, John, for that question and for inviting Amanda to be part of this briefing and setting the theme. So immediately, it's very clear that the liquidity crunch, or at least the debt crisis on the African continent, is being presented as a liquidity crunch and lack of cash in order to finance government operations or fund development projects. But when one takes a closer look, there are some structural problems that many economies are struggling with. And this can be evidenced by the low value chain, the low level that African economies find themselves in the global value and supply chain. So largely speaking, the continent is still an exporter of primary commodities and an importer of finished goods. And what that means is that there is a consistent structural trade deficit that exists within many of the African economies, and therefore the revenues that are being raised to finance their development agenda is always in shortfall. And therefore, it forces many African governments to then go and look for other forms of finance, particularly loans, to finance these projects. The reasons for this is that, the way the investment structure of the continent has been set up within its interaction with the global system has deliberately and purposefully locked us in this low value, low supply chain order and economic system. So any attempt for us to try and move away or move up this value chain is hindered either by very stringent regulations, is hindered by the inability to access technology, and also the inability to access the requisite finance to be able to transform our economies and move us up the global value and supply chains. And so when you look at that sort of analysis and you look at the perspective of where the continent finds itself today, it's no surprise that many, I think you mentioned 31 African countries find themselves in a situation of either being in high debt distress or in debt distress. So it's because of these structural traps, whether it's on trade, whether it's in industry and manufacturing, where we're not able to come out of this vicious cycle that we find ourselves in, producing only primary commodities or primary exports that are of the low end of the value chain and importing finished goods.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason. I think you've outlined very well the structural traps. Just sticking to you, what do you see as the solutions to those structural deficiencies that you've outlined?
So first and foremost, we need to, at least during this weekend when the heads of state are meeting, encourage them to first of all take a coherent and coordinated approach to industrialization and manufacturing. This is a huge opportunity, particularly with the way the economies are beginning to look for finance and get finance into the continent. We are amidst a climate emergency, and a lot of people are discussing ways of providing resources for supporting the continent to transition from its current energy. So perhaps this is an opportunity to leverage some of that finance to figure out and see how to use that finance to develop and structurally transform our economies. I think secondly, we need to relook also at how the investment approach of the continent is and start taking stock of the wealth of resources that we have on the continent and make sure that we understand what value we are bringing to global trade, global investment, and global commerce. I think there's many reports that are in the public domain, particularly this week, that are saying and stating very clearly that Africa is a net creditor to the world. And therefore, I think as the heads of state meet this weekend, these are the kind of things that they should keep in mind when they're rethinking how to negotiate their investment programs and leveraging finance into the continent.
Thank you so much. I liked how you started talking about the liquidity crisis. And I think when you look at how the global financial architecture, especially the international financial institutions, behave in trying to solve that liquidity crisis by injecting more dollars in our economies, that then gives confidence to the market, and our governments are able to issue Eurobonds and pride themselves as the global market having confidence in the economy. I'll come to you, Marvis. Jason has talked about those structural deficiencies, and there have been attempts to actually reform the global financial architecture, which is at the core of the structural traps that Africa finds itself in. To what extent do you think the call for reforms of the global financial architecture will deliver the transformation that Africa requires, will deliver energy access to the continent, will deliver the kind of industrialization that Jason was talking about?
Thank you very much for that, Joanne. I mean, look, let's start with the institutions and systems you are talking about. They were set up 80 years ago. When they were set up, most countries on this continent were economies, working elsewhere. Secondly, I think most of us in this room, we are a lot of females, did not have a vote. I mean, that was the world in which they were set out in. So when you think about that system, and you think about the fact that over the past 80 years, there's been lots of tweaks to that system rather than a major overhaul. It's understandable why the world is asking for the financial architecture to be overhauled. And it needs to be overhauled for four main reasons. One, we are dealing with some real intersectional challenges. You know, the days when you could build a health program or finance a health program and feel comfortable is gone. You know, the pandemic has shown us you can't just finance a health program. The pandemic has shown us you can't just finance a gender program. You really need to think about the interlinkages. The problems the world is navigating now is extremely complex. And as a continent, we are very different. We are very different and we have very different needs. As Jason earlier stated, you know, we've gone from a world where the global financial architecture pushed us away from industrialization to a time where they are encouraging us to industrialize. I mean, it was less than 20 years ago where the word industrialization in Africa was a dirty word. Let's be honest about it. And now we are all talking about green industrialization. So what we are asking for in this reform is really three things, okay? We need better money and we need fairer money. Secondly, we need the institutions to reform and improve. And thirdly, we need a voice. And if you bear with me, I'll just pick each of these things out. The first one is on finance. We need more and fairer IDA. And I don't think by asking a more and fairer IDA, we are begging. You know, IDA is a global public good in all but name. And I think, given how much Africa has given to the world thus far, requesting that the world gives us something back in the form of a much better replenished IDA, it's not a bad thing. Secondly, we are asking for a recycling of SDRs. Jason said earlier on that, you know, we are a net contributor of capital. Okay, if we're a net contributor of capital, why is it that when we issue SDRs, we get less than 4% of it? And we're not, you know, we're saying redirect the SDRs that are sitting there idle through African institutions. And the AFDB and other African institutions have shown that they can actually expand this more than 10 times. They can do so much more with it. And we're not asking for it to be free. It's something we will pay back. And idle is a loan. It's not like it's free. We have to pay it back. And if I may borrow Hannah, I think Hannah always says that we talk about idle as if it's a free gift. It's not. Our children and grandchildren will have to pay this thing back. And thirdly, we're talking about green finance, okay? Green finance is not about necessarily saying to us, we're not going to invest in anything to do with gas. It's about building green value chains, okay? And Africa could be a real net contributor to our global climate challenge if the world works with us to invest in green value chains. And we need to invest in those green value chains because whether the world likes it or not, we are the fastest growing continent. Our footprint is huge and rapidly increasing. We are a large market and a rapidly growing market. And I think about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, the world woke up and China was this powerhouse. Okay? Africa is a powerhouse. And it's not just a powerhouse on the African continent. African diaspora are everywhere. We are part of this global system. So it's really important that these factors are taken into account when we drive this agenda. So the ask here is let's shift from pledges to action. We cannot board with the pledges. Let's go into actions and results. We want institutional reforms, okay? The evolution roadmap is great. It looks great on paper. But the proof is going to be in the pudding, as we say in good old Blighty. We're going to check whether it whether it happens or not is going to be whether World Bank staff are incentivized for results rather than incentivized for getting a loan out there. Whether we can turn around an investment in 2 years or less rather than the current 5 to 6 years that on average that it is right now. Because I still remember World Bank loans when I was at DFID, when I was working at DFID, we had World Bank loans that were discussed, and by the time it came out, I think I had 2 promotions. Okay, that, the world would have moved on and the loan is almost defunct. So that's really important. And then the G20 common framework on. We keep talking about Zambia. We've been talking about this overhaul of this framework now for almost 3 years. Countries are struggling. And if countries are struggling doesn't work, children are dying, if that's a better way of putting it. So we need to stop talking and acting. And finally, voice. We're talking about representation, fairer share representation at the bank. We're talking about a fairer quota system. And here I can't blame us as a continent. We haven't said what we want. We've kind of joined the developing country bandwagon. No, yes, there's a lot of developing countries in Africa, but we need to have an Africa statement of where we stand. And that is really important. And I think this is important because it's about commitment. A year ago, we were all arming and ahhing on whether the AU would join the G21. We were all like, is it going to happen? India said it was going to happen, and it happened. So if we are committed, if the world is committed, it can happen. And that's why for us, the work we are doing tomorrow with the AUC, UNECA, and African presidents to talk about the global financial architecture and the role of Africa and Africa financial institutions in shaping that global financial architecture is fundamental. So, sorry, I had a lot to say, but you kind of got to be on my passion bandwagon today.
Thank you, Mavis. You spoke about very pertinent issues. I'll come back to you. You said the World Bank's evolution roadmap, for example, is great, right?
On paper.
On paper. And some of us, when we look at that roadmap, it's actually taking a private sector first approach. And so, to a certain extent, that's problematic because it means profits for the private sector and risk, socializing risk to the public. That has been the World Bank's approach. He talked about the quota system. We saw the IMF's quota review process that happened last year, the 16th quota review, and the outcome of that, nothing actually moved. So when we're talking about reforms, what are we exactly talking about? What do we want? And you said Africa has to state what it actually wants. I'll go to our panelist online, Hannah. Thank you so much. Your name has been mentioned in the room a number of times. The nature of Africa's debt has changed from what it was when there was a debt workout, an attempt to solve Africa's debt crisis or the global South debt crisis in the 2000s, what was known as the Jubilee moment. So with the change in the nature of Africa's debt, it comes with the complexities, and I can actually say that on your background. And with those complexities, as we try to work out solutions, pitfalls that we're likely to fall into. What do you think Africa should avoid doing while trying to navigate these complexities?
Contributions already. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Well, so again, good morning to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and to be representing Development Reimagined in our work in this space. First of all, I think the previous panelists, Jason and Mavis, have already made it quite clear that this is an issue where African governments, we need a lot from the rest of the world. Simple as that. While we can do a lot ourselves, and many governments are trying to do a lot, and there's a lot more that we can do domestically, in things like having an industrial strategy, all that sort of thing. Many of these things are already on Agenda 2063. They are the fundamental basis of Agenda 2063, but of course, some things have changed in the world, things like the green aspects and so on, in which we do need to take that into account and find our way to try to kind of make the most of what those things are that have changed. At the same time, what we have seen, and Mavis was talking about it earlier, we have got these international financial institutions and the general structure of the global financial architecture, which is really has hardly changed. And yes, we have a number of new, well, we don't even need to call them new. There are actors who have been around for a long time, but we have been able to avail their resources more recently. Those actors include China, whose resources, partly because China itself has grown and therefore been able to also provide extra resources to others. But also the private sector has also become a bigger lender. Again, private sector has grown and has a surplus of resources. So we have been able to use those resources. But I think we've got to go back to, back in the 1980s, African governments were coordinating, also realizing that their aspirations were not going to be met just, especially things like infrastructure building, were not going to be met just by using our own domestic resources. Our economies had effectively been decimated, including through colonialism. So how are we going to actually kind of develop? And these are the same problems that we're still trying to face today. If we were to meet Agenda 2063, my colleagues at Development Reimagined have estimated the forecasting needs for 13 African countries based on meeting Agenda 2063 and meeting the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Those 13 countries, if you add up what they need just to meet the infrastructure needs for that, make sure that every Ethiopian has access to the internet, has access to water, has access to basic electricity, and across the board for African countries. If you did that, those countries would need between external finance of between 100 and 150 US dollars, approximately billion US dollars a year. If they were to do that through external finance, the way that it works at the moment, they would be crashing their supposed debt sustainability thresholds within a few years, and many countries already have done. So the way that the world functions in terms of the global financial architecture is not good enough to meet those kinds of needs. And I think, going back to the point that Mavis was talking about 80 years ago, these major powers at the time were the global financial institutions were never designed to support development beyond the major powers. And so it's not a surprise that, for example, the IMF, it's meant to be the lender of last resort. The overall loans that we have from the IMF at the moment as an African continent, around 58 billion US dollars we owe to the IMF. This is the world's lender of last resort. We spent 63 billion US dollars on COVID-19 response in 1 year. And that was a very small amount compared to the rest of the world. We spent that was equivalent to about 2.5% of our GDP. The G20 countries were spending 13% of their GDP to respond to COVID. So if that's the case, and then when the IMF brought out its best instrument, you talk about IMF quota reform, when the IMF brought out its best instrument, special drawing rights for everybody, 650 billion US dollars of special drawing rights, we got 33 billion. So you can just see there is a major shift. But I think this African Union summit, coming back to the summit itself, is really important and different because we are now a member of the G20. We're now a member of the G21. And I think that is a major opportunity for us to be able to not just point out to some of these inequities and challenges that we face, but also to be able to find new solutions. And some of those solutions, in some ways, are old solutions. Some of them are totally innovative ones. But I tell you what's not going to be good enough is just putting extra money into the Bretton Woods institutions. That has been what has been the answer for a long time. That hasn't delivered. It's not good enough. Similarly, a new kind of Jubilee type effort also is not good enough because it doesn't go to the fundamental needs to increase extra finance. So we'll just come back here. History will repeat itself in another 20 years or even shorter time. And what countries are doing right now, like, yes, Kenya's gone back to the market, gone to the Eurobonds and so on, been able to kind of paper over that initial challenge in 2024. But in 2027 and 2028, we've got another 2.5 billion of Eurobonds to refinance in total in Kenya. And again, that's going to be a challenge for us too. So we can't just paper over these challenges. We need to actually address them. And I think the AU Summit is a great opportunity for us to work out that position.
Thank you so much, Hannah. You talked about dealing with the fundamentals. You talked about industrial strategy. How do we then avoid just being given, it's like you're in a hole and someone is just giving you some crumbs of bread, some water to keep you alive or to sustain you for another week, but it's actually not giving you the ladder to come out of the hole. Patrick, Marvis spoke about voice, and Hannah has talked about the AU being now a permanent member of the G21. This summit is critical. What do you think, or first of all, how do you think the African Union should engage in the G20, G21, and what should be the priorities of the African Union in the G21, particularly looking at this year, next year, where the leadership of the G21 is in the global south. President Lula, who will actually be in town, has focused on the reform of global financial architecture from President Lula's leadership of the G21 will then come to South Africa, which is another opportunity for the continent. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, my dear brother. Good morning to everyone. It is certainly a pleasure to see you all in this room today and to feel the passion that we can see in the room. I would like first of all to thank all my co-panelists who were able to set the scene very eloquently. And in fact, I don't know what to say, truly, because we are at a shifting point where there is no other option than only moving forward and making sure that the continent is engaged firmly in the transformative process that is required, to achieve a 2026 achieve. And this summit, as you said, just to start with the relevance of the summit, is one of the critical continental moments where our leaders will gather here in Addis Ababa to take decisive decisions, important decisions that are going to pave the way to the stronger continent that we are looking forward. In the perspective, if you look at the theme of the summit, as you said in your introductory word, it is fully aligned with the strategic thinking that we are seeing, happening within the continent since a few years. When we talk about education, science, technology, innovation, these are critical enablers to make sure that we are able to reap the advantages of the African continental free trade area, which is one of the larger markets in the world today, not only in terms of the numbers of countries that are participating, but in terms also of economic opportunities that are available to unlock the potential of the most powerful continent in the world. Because we have to be saying to ourselves that we are certainly the powerful continent in the world. We are the one fueling, the global growth. Because if you look at the resources that are needed to accelerate transformative processes globally, those resources are actually available in Africa. And the fact that we are not able to industrialize and to take advantage of those resources is the source of our problems. Why do I say that? If you look at the size of the population today, you have a market of 1.4 billion people, but unfortunately, at the same time, our level of industrialization is extremely low. If you look at the agricultural production, we are not at the level that is expected to feed our population, which, as I said, is a huge market. But into the case, as starting from now, we will have the most important population size of the world because we will be 2.7 billion people, which will be the population of China and India combined. So imagine the potential of that country if they invested in education. The statistics that we have as we speak today are showing that if we invest strategically in education, science, and technology today, we will be able to accelerate the GDP of the continent by 20 times in the same period. So you can imagine how important it is for us to invest in those strategic sectors. So looking at the global discussions that we are having, the way Africa is positioning itself, in the global discussion, you alluded to the recent admission of the African Union as permanent member of the G20. It is an extremely important opportunity for the continent, not to go there, beg for more support, but to go and discuss about the strategic issues that are pertinent. First of all, to serve the interest of the continent, and secondly, to build a prosperous world that we are all expecting. Because the growth and the prosperity of Africa will signify also the prosperity of the world. Imagine the immense opportunity, the investment opportunities that are available within the continent. If we are able to build a cohesive continental and global environment that speaks to those issues of investment, we are sure that in the next decades, we will be able to build, a prosperous world. Just look at the issues that are around insecurity, because you can see that globally insecurity is getting higher and higher. I don't want to allude to some conflicts that we are seeing looming and that are happening now globally. All those conflicts, if you look at the impact of those in Africa's growth and into the global economy, you will see that the solutions that Africa can propose in terms of, reducing violence and insecurity are important. It speaks to one issue that is also pertinent in that perspective, which is the issue of stemming illicit financial flows that are driving the continent from an approximate amount of 90 billion US dollar per year. If we are able, at the continent and with our global partners in the G20 framework to build comprehensive frameworks that are going to fight against illicit financial flows, I am sure that we will be able to use those resources to actually accelerate productive transformative processes within the continent. Secondly, if you look at the global discussion now in terms of the global taxation architecture, Africa has shown leadership in that space. And I would like to take this opportunity to express the support of the African Union and of its leaders to the African New York, who is, spearheading the continental strategy with regards to redressing the imbalances in the tax systems. You can see that if we are able to build an inclusive, fair, and transparent taxation system, we will be able to also accelerate our ability to raise domestic resources that are important, because no one will come in Africa to bring the resources that we need to address our issues. We have already spoken about the failures of the global financial architecture. I don't want to allude to it again. But when you look at the unfairness of the global financial architecture, you will see that it has been designed, as Ellie said, not to serve the purpose, not only of Africa, but of all the global south, because we are all experiencing the same challenges of financing, access to capital, credit rating agencies. If you look at how we are rated, you can see that there is certainly a room of opportunity to make sure that in the G20 discussions, we are able to table those positions on the continent with regards to the ones that we are expecting. Lastly, if you look at debt architecture and look at the climate finance today, you can see that even with the climate finance architecture today, there is a need for improvement, because it is certainly not speaking to the issues that the continent is facing in terms of climate change. We are contributing at a level of 2.7% of the global greenhouse gas emission. But unfortunately, the resources that we are taking are less than that percentage in terms of disbursement. So there is need to engage firmly, but to engage with extremely strategic positions. And one of the things that we have to understand is that we are at the point of our destiny where there is no other possibility than only moving forward. We cannot move backward because we are already at the bottom of everything. So we need to make sure that we are still progress. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Patrick. Just when you're talking about the 90 billion and relating that what Hannah said, that we need about 100 to 150 billion dollars annually in external financing. So if we are able to just stem illicit financial flows, we'll have reduced that figure to about 10 billion, right? So we have the solutions. It requires that political leadership. The last question before I open it up to those in the room and those joining us online, and all of you feel free to answer this question. We are seeing, as we make progress, certain traps are also being laid, or what I'll call distractions. As we're making progress, for example, on the global taxation architecture, we are seeing other initiatives coming up. We're seeing, for example, the launch of the International Tax Task Force. Is this a distraction? As we talk about our critical minerals for green industrialization, for leading the rest of the world in transitioning to green energy, we've seen with the US, for example, the Inflation Regulatory Act, basically trapping us. We've seen the EU coming up with CBAM, and then they come and then start saying green industrialization. So how do we deal with these traps that are being laid as we make progress as a continent? And you see some of these initiatives that actually some of our own African governments are spearheading as a distraction.
Thank you very much, Joel. I think it's important for us to not get caught up in these traps. And as you say, all of them are being used or being developed under the guise of the climate emergency, in particular, as a way of keeping the African continent and keeping us at this very low end of the global value and supply chain. Because many of the things that you mentioned, the US Inflationary Act, the EU CBAM, what they're designed to do is ensure that we continue exporting at the lower end of the global value and supply chain, whilst at the same time, this continuation of the extractive economy, the extractivism that exists in the global architecture, the global design of the trading system continues to permeate this sort of approach. I think it's also important to realize that perhaps, as Patrick has said, is how do we as civil society, as actors who are interested in the transformative agenda of the continent through Agenda 2063, adopt more pragmatic approaches to understand that there are processes that we as a continent, we as a people are now actively engaging, actively leading, as Patrick has mentioned, whether it's the UN Tax Convention, whether it's the membership of the G21, to actually be very more forceful and adamant that we have a coherent and coordinated position that talks about the ineffectiveness of these institutions, of these processes. And I should also add that we must not fall also into the trap of siloing these issues, because there are significant intersections that exist. If you solve illicit financial flows and you're still exporting flowers, you're going to be in the same position. If you provide debt cancellation and you're still exporting copper ore, you're going to be in the same position, because the structure of our economies and the structure of the international trading, finance, economic, and commerce system has not changed to adapt and to allow the continent to then be able to move up these changes. So when we talk about the architecture, let's not also be caught up in just the finance. I think the entire economic and commerce and trading architecture is open for debate and should be open for debate and discussion in being reformed. I think soon after this meeting, the summit here this weekend, in a couple of weeks, there's going to be the ministerial conference, the 13th ministerial conference of the World Trade Organization, and I hope also the ministers of trade, buoyed by the membership of the G21, will take a very strong message to Abu Dhabi about also having to reform and change the way the global trading system. So I think for me, those are also the other types of distractions that we must be aware of. This idea that
So for me, it's only a distraction if we make it a distraction. As Africa, we need to acknowledge that other sub-regions and other countries have their own interests, okay? The EU works for EU's interests. The US works for US interests. Africa needs to work for Africa's interests. So for me, it only becomes a distraction if we permit it to be a distraction. And often, civil society can be very good at allowing these distractions to be a big deal. I think right now, our number one priority should focus on Africa and pushing our governments to stop talking about African unity and start acting for Africa unity. Okay, that for me is our number one priority. So, Jason talked a bit about, the importance of us having a clear industrial path. Patrick talked a lot about the importance of us transforming our economies. No single country on this continent can transform on its own. We need to work as regional value chains, okay? We need to work together. So just to give you a couple of data sets. One, Assets Research Africa Transformation Index showed that 30 countries that represent over 85% of our GDP is regressing on transformation. That's a problem. And we were regressing before COVID. This is not a COVID issue. We were regressing before COVID. So if we are regressing in our transformation and those countries represent 85% of our GDP, we have a problem, okay? That's point number one. Point number two is whether we started doing on global value chains. Do you know that as a continent, our largest cost on production is actually on inputs? The inputs we buy, so the machinery we use, the sugar we process, the this we buy. But the irony of it is if you are producing chocolate in West Africa, okay, you buy solids in West Africa, you import milk from Europe, okay, you import sugar from Europe or North America, you import the machinery, yeah? The thing that really struck me as we started doing this research was powdered milk is shipped from Africa to Europe. Another part of Africa buys it. Okay. Sugar is shipped from one part of Africa to Europe, and another part of Africa buys it. Isn't there a flaw in that? There's a fundamental problem here if we are going to transform. So we talk about AFCFTA, we talk about African Union, we talk about growth, okay? We talk about all of these things. Yet we have systems that we have developed or we have allowed others to impose on us, okay? That is undermining our own transformation. And we talk about unity, but don't act in unity. So my response is, no, it's not a distraction. Let's not be distracted by it, Joab. Instead, let's spend our energy this weekend asking our leaders to shift from talking about African unity to acting in unity for us to transform our economies and deal with some of the fundamental issues we're talking about right now, illicit finance flows. It won't work if, making up names by the way, media, it's not facts, just using examples. If South Africa signs up an illicit financial flow agreement or says we're going to introduce tax X, okay, actually let's use Kenya. Kenya's recent taxes, okay, is causing an absolute uproar. Now, if another country embraces those companies overnight on the same continent, isn't that a bit of a lost cause? Okay. We were not invited into the African Union because there was sudden generosity. We were invited into the African Union because geopolitically we are needed. As a continent, we are needed economically. And we are being brought to the table. Let's not go to the table and forget what should be at the heart of our agenda. And at the heart of our agenda should be Africa's integration, Africa's unity. That should be our North Star. And whatever we negotiate should get us to doing that so that we truly transform and deal with the structural challenges that we're talking about. Because if in 20 years, my children are having this conversation, like my parents had this conversation 20 years ago, I will be gutted. Seriously. And we all should be disappointed in ourselves. Sorry, that was my moment there.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Hannah.
Yeah, I think there's two things. Number one, especially as we're thinking about sort of media coverage as well of the summit and what can be done, but also of all of these sorts of issues around debt. Number one, let's have a healthy skepticism of these different initiatives. Yes, some of them can be helpful in and of themselves, but also remember sometimes that some of them are also in some ways papering over, or in some ways saying, well, we can't deal with this big issue, so why don't we just try and do something small here, which seems more feasible. But in the end, sometimes things that are more feasible are not necessarily in African interest. And that's the second thing. We need to get into a mindset. There was a question earlier in the online Q&A about mindsets. We need to get into the mindset of thinking about our position, African positions, where we are not constrained by what others' interests are, and that we're not constrained by the way the system works right now. We need to be thinking about, if we were designing these things from scratch, what would they look like? Job, you talked about IMF quota reform, a really good one. Very easy if you're thinking about, if we were designing that from scratch, what would the quotas look like? They would look very different. We wouldn't just have less than 5% of IMF quotas. We would have a much larger amount, and therefore not just have access to those resources, but also be able to direct the way that IMF works. And that can be justified in lots of different ways. We don't just have to justify it in the same way that it's justified in the way right now. We can justify it in different ways. So I think those would be my two suggestions in terms of initiatives that come out, including on debt, but also on industrialization, global supply chains, etc. Yes, we can work together on it, but let's also just have a healthy skepticism around them and think about how we can redesign them ourselves.
Thank you so much, Hannah. There are a couple of questions coming in online. And Patrick, do you have some comments on that question?
Yes, thank you very much. Just quickly, what I'm going to say and what we have to be mindful of is that our development is not a technical issue. It's a human problem. It's not a technical issue. So those words that you hear, the poor countries, all those things, that is not the way to handle the issue. If you place people at the center of your priorities, you are sure that you will certainly achieve the transformative process that you are aiming to. We spoke about education. What type of education should we do? Is it just education to have certificates that are not, giving the possibility to people to unlock their individual possibilities? What we have to do is to understand that we are on our own and that there is no one that will help save us. Those stories of the big continental Marshall Plan supported by external forces never happened. We have to be mindful of that. In the darkness of our problems, we have to find the light that will lead us to success. The distractions, the groups that are created, and all those should never take us out of the road that we have decided to follow. We have said we are leading our continent to prosperity. That is the only option, and there is no other option, Benjamin.
Thank you so much. We shouldn't be distracted. We should be clear on what our vision is. We should be clear on what our industrial strategy is. Otherwise, we're going to be part of other people's vision. We're going to be part of the Matei plan as we saw last month. And so I like what you're saying, that our development is not a technical issue, it is a human issue. And Hannah, the healthy skepticism on these particular issues or things that we're seeing, I think it's really, really important to take note of that. I want to open up the floor for questions from journalists. We have a number of questions online, but I'd like to give perspective. We have a roving mic.
Good morning. My name is Mutenda Matiano from LNN24 SA. Right. So my question is a bit speaking to the issue that you brought up, Mavis, where we've got a distraction that is happening with African countries being forced to adhere to certain rules, regulations, customs, some of which are not even international law. And they acquiesce to these that then become handcuffs on Africa. And because we're talking to people that are financially minded, I wanted to bring to mind the issue of the stemming of illicit flows. It feeds into the aspect of the Financial Action Task Force. So the Financial Action Task Force was created by the G7, and it was obviously created to control the flow of finance from first world countries to third world countries, particularly with the diaspora that is growing in the West and beginning to repatriate funds. And quickly they began to denounce the financing of terrorism, money laundering, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, which we all know that African countries are not doing. They blacklist African countries or graylist African countries for not following the recommendations that they make. But the very same Financial Action Task Force had these same recommendations in 2008 when the Western world collapsed the financial system. We never saw a single Western country getting graylisted. But how is it that our financial directors, our financial ministers, sign up to these treaties that only apply to third world countries? They know that the financing of terrorism is happening from the West. It does not get graylisted, blacklisted. But only African countries get graylisted. What are we doing being part and parcel of these neo-colonial systems and treaties that are not international law, that are unilateral creations of our colonizers? Why are we part and parcel of that? I would just like to understand that from the financial people. And lastly, we've got a country and countries on the African continent that are still under French control. We've got South Africa, which is dominated by white businesses that continue to institute imperialism on the continent, like implementation of Western sanctions. Why are we allowing countries with such economies to become a part and parcel of the Africa Continental Free Trade area, when we know very well that South African banks are going to dominate that institution and they're going to implement Western sanctions like they're doing to their neighboring countries abroad? Why are we allowing that? And how do we use this forum to create rules or to bring about propositions that help us to start identifying these Trojan horses like France Afrique, the companies, and South African banking system that is particularly white and actually does not allow transformation for black banks to be established in South Africa because of a private reserve bank? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any more hands in the room?
Good morning. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Good morning to my colleagues in media. Well, more or less like what one colleague here said. Sorry, I'm Ethan from LN24 SA. My main focus though would be, because he speaks about things that have happened in the past. And that seems like it has been ignored over time. Here we are having such discussions. But my question is more on the recent happenings. One of you spoke about climate change, and you said it very well. You say that some of these things are happening under the guise of climate change, and then it comes as if it's something attractive. African countries then literally sell their countries for a song. Now, how do we extricate ourselves in the now from treaties like the Climate Change Treaty? See, it comes with taxes. There's what they call a carbon footprint tax. That also takes money away from Africa. I mean, Africa is the least affected by climate change, if anything. I don't even think we're even supposed to be talking about climate change. I'm really surprised though at how our African leaders believe that there's climate change. I believe climate change is highly questionable. Is there really climate change? Or is this already another way of trying to enslave Africa financially? And if we run by the mantra of climate change is a reality and we get our African people to pay the taxes, where are we going to get that money from? To be paying for carbon footprint for taxes while we're still having a discussion on how do we stop ourselves from giving away money that is supposed to be for Africa. Then I also wanted to ask, does Africa have to be a part of global taxation? You said something very profound. We farm something in Africa, we export it, we import it back. It really doesn't make sense. It's not even rocket science. Why does it happen? Is it because people are really ignorant? But my main question then becomes, how do we extricate ourselves from such detrimental, selfish, and useless agreements and treaties such as the ones that we find ourselves in? Thank you.
Thank you so much, my sister. Neocolonial systems, carbon taxes, and what you're seeing. What you're seeing also is with this green industrialization, we are seeing like green industrial zones coming up in Namibia. We're seeing this in Mauritania, and you're seeing the companies that are operating there. So you produce green hydrogen, produce great steel, export it to Europe. You're not part of the CBAM, right? So I just want to read a few questions from online, and then we will respond because they are related to, they're actually interrelated. And then I'll come to you, Kiama. Question to Jason, what are the key challenges that African countries face in managing their debt? So very specific question. Hannah Ryder, how can African countries balance the need for development and the risk of increasing debt? Mavis, what specific strategies does ASET recommend for this kind of transformation to happen? Dr. Patrick, what policies can the African Union Commission implement to help member states manage their debt? Kiama, and then we come back to you.
Thank you so much for the presentations. I'd like to echo sentiments from my brother there. But I'd also like to ask the panelists, nothing that you say is new. This is as we said before, I think over the last decade. So how are we moving forward? Like what is the action? Because I think all over Africa we have great analysis by experts, by a very well educated analysts. But what we're now seeing is moving. And then why are we appealing from these regimes that are in power, our governments? For example, I'll give an example, Kenya. A few days ago, we took a Eurobond to pay another Eurobond. And when you're selling these Eurobond at 9.5% yield, basically we're now selling debt to the highest bidder in the international market. And then that has been used to prop up the dollar that was collapsing in the country to the point where the dollar strengthened for a few days. in which the rumor is that the Central Bank of Kenya was buying the dollar at a low price and selling it at a higher price just to prop it up and to also make extra money. Are these the governments we are advocating to, in terms of fiscal policy and that kind of thing? And who are these governments actually working for? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll come back to the panelists. Maybe I'll start with you, Hannah, just based on the questions that have come from the floor, but also questions that are in the chat.
Great. There's some very good questions. Thank you so much. So I wanted to address two in particular, one on the climate change issue and also on the development and debt. First of all, I think I've worked on climate change issues for a very long time. We have a area of kind of work which is dedicated to that. I think, like with most issues, again, it's distinguishing what kinds of responses are going to be responses which are in African interests and which are not in African interests, or are not going to necessarily promote where we want to go. So an example, I think, I would contrast two things. An example of kind of a real policy, the JETP, the Joint Economic Transformation Program, which South Africa and I think a couple of other African countries have taken part in. We know, for example, that program is ostensibly kind of on paper designed to support South Africa to make a transition from kind of a high carbon, high coal economy to renewables, but and it's with a number of creditors around the room, including private sector, etc., and just one government. And I think that is a really good example of what not to do, because you end up being, and this is how, most even debt negotiations in general are, one government plus lots of other governments and actors, and you're not going to have your interests are not going to be at the forefront if you're the only one in the room. So it's those sorts of issues. If you're not coordinating, if you're not kind of exchanging notes with others, if you're not working together in the region, for example, but you're having discussions with external partners, you're not going to be in a position where you're going to be able to advocate and deliver the best outcomes. So that's the sort of arrangement to avoid. The kind of arrangement to go for, if we're talking about climate change negotiations, is to use the negotiations which are happening on the loss and damage fund to find ways of creating new mechanisms, setting up kind of new precedent mechanisms for that will deliver finance in an automatic and non-conditional way. For example, a financial transactions tax could be the mechanism that finances a loss and damage fund. If that is our African position, a joint African position, as an example, that's where we can use the climate negotiations to set new precedent for new things which have never been done before. And I think those are the kinds of things that we can do internationally and as a group in order to make the world a better place. A good example of using precedent, again, where we've got South Africa did this very recently. They used precedent that had been set in the Myanmar case brought by Gambia, and which was a case Gambia didn't really have a particular interest in it, and South Africa used that as a precedent to then argue at the ICJ for the issues around genocide in Gaza. So we have the ability to use international institutions in a really helpful way, and a way to use international law and precedent that has been set. But it must be through working together rather than being in one room with other creditors or other international external partners. The second point, just on debt and development, I think we have to remember that debt is not a bad word necessarily, and debt can be used in a really helpful way. Think about it like, as a young student, you might get a loan for university. You might get a loan to have a home, to get a mortgage for your house. That is a loan. But in the end, that house is something that you're investing in. You're going to bring up a family there, or in university is going to give you a job, etc. That debt is a good debt. It's not the same as just going and spending money on sweets and clothes, right? And the same thing happens with countries. So we can look for debt and aim for debt which is going to be spent on good things and capital investment, but at the same time we should make sure that debt is the cheapest debt available. And of the cheapest debt instruments available, African countries really do not get anywhere near enough. The global financial system is not designed to give us cheap debt. And that's why we have some of the challenges that we do right now. We don't get enough cheap debt. Our debt is too small compared to what we really need in order to get us through the university and through to get us to those mortgages that really will make a difference to our standard of life. And that's what the global financial architecture should be solving, and that's what we have to push it to do, including through our positioning at the African Union, with the African Union being in the G21. It is a major opportunity for us to do that.
In the room, Jason, just 2 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I'll build on some of the points that Hannah's already made. To try and answer the question on the debt management challenges. So of course, here Hannah's mentioned utilization, but linked to that is also the type of debts that our governments borrow or have been, forced towards borrowing. Short-term bonds in particular that have very short repayment periods, but the return on investment on that debt with regard to the projects they're financing tends to be a much longer period. And I think this is something that does pose a big challenge for effective debt management in ministries of finance or national treasuries, because immediately within 2 or 3 years, some bond repayments are due, but even the projects that were supposed to be funded from those bonds have not even started. So you're already, in terms of cash flow, you find yourself in a very difficult position. And this is why, in part, the argument about the debt crisis unfortunately is a liquidity issue. But there's also the other part about the return on investment. I think the second point related to some of this is that there has been a proliferation of creditors on the continent over the last 10 to 15 years. And so our laws, our policy, our borrowing strategies have not necessarily kept a pace with how the creditor landscape has changed. And this is not just at the domestic level, it's also at the continental and international level, because as we're seeing, when countries get into crisis or are unable to pay those debts, there isn't a holistic mechanism in place. The common framework that was launched 3 years ago excludes very clearly private creditors and multilateral lenders from those negotiations. It's one of the reasons why Zambia, for example, has had a very long time, to try and complete its negotiations. And I think Ghana is almost similarly going to go through that sort of pain. So I think understanding that creditor landscape has also contributed to some of the debt management challenges. I think lastly, what I will say at a domestic level is the role of oversight agencies and institutions have been captured. And the rules that govern or the separation of powers between the executive, the legislator, and the judiciary, those lines have been very blurred when it comes to borrowing. You find in many countries on the continent, the executive still holds a lot of sway in ensuring that certain types of borrowing is being done. And the role of oversight from the legislator and parliaments has almost completely been eroded. All they act is as a rubber stamp to approve the loans from being borrowed. So I think that's also a very important part of the equation that we must consider. But not just to put the spotlight, and I have said this before, we should not just only put the spotlight domestically on borrowing countries. I think lenders also have a responsibility in perpetuating or propping up governments or regimes that borrow in an irresponsible way. So the issue of irresponsible lending is also a big debt management problem. We've seen this in countries like Mozambique, the tuna bond scandal, where two big international investment banks were found guilty of just pumping in money into make-believe companies that were supposed to be implementing a development project in Mozambique. So I think there's also an opportunity in the conversation we're having today to also put lenders to task in supporting effective debt management in our countries. Thank you.
So very quickly to the question on what is assets recommendations. So for us, for the continent to transform, we have what we call the depth framework, so DEPTH, and we are asking governments to really focus on implementing that framework. So invest in diversifying your economies from a heavy dependence on raw materials. And one of the reasons countries did so poorly on transformation in the transformation index is that actually there were some countries that were regressive. They were reducing their diversification, which was a bit strange, even in my own country, Ghana. So if you invest in diversifying your economy from a dependence on a handful of raw materials, then it makes you more export competitive. And if you are export competitive, you are less vulnerable to external shocks, because when external shocks come, you actually have a diversified base on which you are raising your revenues and making money. We really need to invest in productivity. Patrick talked a lot about the importance of skills. It's not just about skills. I don't know whether it was Jason or Hannah that talked about energy. It's about all our productive inputs are really, really critical. We have to invest in technology. I think recently I hear practically everybody talking about how Africa has done so well because we have shifted from 40% coverage of internet to 80%. What nobody talks about is the fact that less than 20% of that coverage is productive use. So we're not using technological advances for productive use, and we need to improve on that. And all of this is pointless if it's not improving human well-being, if we are not ensuring that our people are actually benefiting from it. But at the heart of it is regional integration. And the last Africa Transformation Report talked about the importance of regional integration for transformation. There is nothing on this continent that is stopping Nigeria from being the center of production for all tractors on the continent. We shouldn't be importing tractors. Why can't Nigeria be producing tractors? Why can't South Africa be producing something else? Why can't we build centers of excellence that enables us to really develop and build value chains and transform and export? Why are we so focused on every single country doing everything? It's not cost effective. So, there's often a saying that when Nigeria sneezes, Togo catches a flu. We have so many countries that are small. We need to work together. We need to build centers of excellence if we are going to be competitive. That's how Europe did it. That's how America, it's a huge country, but it has its own centers of excellence. If we don't do that in Africa, then we are never going to be competitive. And just very, very quickly, on the point on, the global institutions and the global contracts that we are signing out to, I'm afraid we live in a world. We are interlinked. What we need to do differently is to negotiate better for Africa with a North Star in mind. We can't extract ourselves from the world. We just need to be better in our negotiations. Together, not alone, together.
Thank you. I was just wondering what happened to the Ghana beyond oil, beyond aid narrative. And also, why, I'm asking myself, Patrick, why is it that it's Total that sponsored AFCON and not Dangote?
Yes, unfortunately, these are the issues that we are faced with. And I would like to start by, acknowledging the comment that came, or the question that came from our colleague sitting behind about the need to, I don't want to say decolonialize, but I want to say to really assess access to our sovereignty. We have a discussion tomorrow, and if you do agree, maybe we can share the link to that excellent conversation that will be presidential dialogue on the establishment of the African Union financial institutions in the framework of the global financial architecture reform and the launch of the African Club. You spoke about financial independence. Since the 1960s, there is a debate that has grown and been prominent. And the consensus was that if Africa is unable to build its own financial institutions, we will never get to accelerate progress towards transformation. Those institutions are the African Central Bank, the African Monetary Fund, the African Investment Bank, and the Pan-African Stock Exchange. Since adoption of those institutions by heads of state in the 1990s, we have not yet been able to come to the level of implementation because we are lagging behind in terms of signing the legal instruments and ratifying them. There is no one who can sign those instruments for us. This is the member states' driven process. They have to sign and they have to ratify. We have been quick in signing the agreement for the African Continental Free Trade Area. In my perspective, and that is my view, it was certainly a good move, but it was not a move that was coherent with what needed to be done. Because with the continental market that we are creating, it was also important to move faster in developing the financial system that will support that huge market. As of today, we haven't seen that. And if you look and if you read the archives of the Union in the 1980s, it was clearly stipulated that even if we build the continental market, we will fail if we fail having the continental financial architecture set up and the continental productive architecture was well set up. As of today, nothing has happened. When you talk about the African continental free trade area, yes, you said something that is important. How can you export raw materials and import them at a higher cost and you are not able to transform them within the continent? We need to make sure that we have those centers of excellence and industrial parks that will be able to transform the continent and produce the good that we need to produce. One of the most important and critical points is how do we make sure that we are able to feed our people in the next few decades? Until now, if we continue with the level of agriculture that we have today, we will continuously fail and we will not be able to, achieve our food. I know he doesn't like certain words because I can see Professor Campbell in the room. So if we are not able to achieve our food, sovereignty, I don't know, independence or sovereignty. So I know what you mean. So you see, we will continue being trapped in that, system that has not been designed for us. Because the first thing you have to do is to make sure that you are able to feed your people and that you are able to link their anticipation not to the short-term anticipations, but to the long-term anticipation of a transformative process that works. So for us at the African Union Commission, we remain committed. we are working tirelessly, and we do hope that by the coming years we'll be able to, establish the African Union financial institutions as quickly as possible. Secondly, for this year, we are looking at organizing a continental, discussion on debt. Because since we are trapped in this new debt cycle, we haven't had the opportunity to come together and to design comprehensive solutions that are going to lead us to escape from the trap that we see ahead of us. So we will do that this year with your support, and we do hope that we will get gradually in designing the right policies, as it was said, the right policies to help member states navigating this difficult environment. We are living in an extremely turbulent environment, and we have already been saying that it is a rule-based, but also a power-based system in which we are evolving. Our aim today is to start dismantling the rules to make sure that they are coherent with our transformative processes. One, as I said, is the discussion on the tax architecture. We will now also concentrate hugely on the reform of the global architecture. And in this perspective, we are working with the ESET to make sure that we are able to come up with a roadmap and the strategic priorities of the continent in that discussion. And we will make sure that we put state, that we put the necessary leadership that is needed. And tomorrow we're going to secure that leadership forward. So thank you very much again.
Thank you so much. Friends, we have to bring this to a close. And I'd just like to give each one of us, the panelists, 20 seconds to give one recommendation. And I'll start with Jason. So Jason, if you have the opportunity to provide this one recommendation to the African leaders meeting in Mandela Hall at the African Union, what would that be?
Ratify the protocols establishing the AFRODAD.
Thank you. Marvis, this is your question.
I'm sorry, I was going to answer my question.
Thank you so much. You're sitting in the Conference of Ministers of Finance this year happening in Zimbabwe, and it was end of this month. And it's unique this time that they've invited ministers of energy, ministers of industry and trade, potentially ministers of environment. What would be this one recommendation to them?
Stop ratifying protocols that you are not implementing. Please start to implement the protocols that you have ratified of the AFTFTA so that we can start transforming this economy.
Thank you. Hannah, you talked about working on climate for quite some time. This year's Conference of Parties, COP29, will focus on finance. If you are in Azerbaijan come November, what will this be? What will the one recommendation say? And please, talking about the scale that's needed on climate finance.
Yeah, there's only one for that one. I would say to push for financial transactions tax as the mechanism for a loss and damage fund. Really simple.
Thank you. Patrick, sitting in the G21 room under President Lula's leadership, what would be one recommendation?
The recommendation is to make sure that 2020, policies and frameworks work for our development. And this is what we are trying to say to make sure that our priorities are, featuring in that space. To conclude, and in perspective of what we said, we will, engage with the civil society, with the African media, to make sure that 2024 be a milestone year as we did last year. And building on the achievement of last year, we have not proposed because the heads of it have committed already to organize an extraordinary session on the African Union financial institutions. And that has been accepted by the champion of the African Union financial institution, the president of Ghana, His Excellency Nana Akufo-Addo. That summit will happen, I think, in July, and it will provide an opportunity to discuss and find optimal solution on the global financial architecture, on the continental financial architecture, on the debt issues and all the related matters. So we will be extremely busy this year, and we count on your support to make sure that we are able to turn the challenges that we see ahead to incredible opportunities for our development. I end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, members of the media. Thank you so much, my panelists, those joining us online. Hannah, thank you so much for being able to join us very early in the morning in your time. Colleagues, the message is clear. We must develop a strategy. We must end the siloed approach to issues without lifting ourselves out of the bottom of the value chain, of the global value chains. We continue being entrapped in debt without investing in our own agriculture, without having a clear industrial policy. We won't come out of this debt crisis. I don't want to summarize because the discussions, the points are very clear, and it was very enriching discussion, and we all agree with me that this is not an end in itself, but it's the beginning of challenging on the continuation of what has been happening in different corridors. And as we engage our leaders as media, as we ask questions to our leaders from tomorrow, I hope that this will inform the kind of questions and the kind of answers that you'll be looking for from our leaders. Thank you. Thank you, Steve.